Hello, my name is Bernal Cruz. I'm the chair of the board for RAIN International. I'm also a child welfare expert, and I'm a case coordinator for unaccompanied children here in the United States. This module is on trauma and recovery and implications for immigrants and refugees. The triple trauma paradigm is a concept that describes trauma that took place in country of origin as number one. Number two, the trauma that occurs along the journey, and the trauma that occurs in resettlement. Of course, as you can probably imagine, people who have been forced to leave their country of origin leave because of things like violence, persecution, political violence, domestic violence, gangs, wars, and other types of conflict. Clearly, traumatic events. Two, the trauma along the journey or transition. The first thing that comes to mind are images of boats in the Mediterranean carrying migrants and refugees from Northern Africa to places in Europe. As you know, these boats oftentimes capsize, people get really sick. Oftentimes these boats are not rescued, or folks in the boats are not rescued. Sometimes they're rejected, they're made to turn around and go to some other place. And I also think, of course, of the unaccompanied children and the stories they've told me about their trajectory and journeys up to the United States, crossing Central America, Mexico, oftentimes on trains or on foot, or really in whatever manner they can. There's a lot of accidents on the train. There's people lose limbs, people experience being assaulted. There are gangs on the train. The children are especially very vulnerable and oftentimes exposed to trafficking and approached to do other kinds of work that really isn't in their best interest. Sometimes the journey can last 2 weeks, sometimes the journey can last 2 years, depending on what's going on. And of course, there are African and Asian children coming through South America, mainly through Brazil, crossing the jungle through Colombia into Central America, and then taking the train or finding their way to the US in whatever means. And finally, there's the trauma in the resettlement. Once a person has survived, say, 20 years in a refugee camp, or once a person has survived all of the traumatic events along their journey, they enter the United States only to begin to experience the incredibly arduous process of adjustment, including things like learning a language or entering a community that isn't necessarily welcoming, and may have some sort of animosity towards a particular group. So we'll talk about some of these manifestations in the next slide. So again, trauma and resettlement. In the field of resettlement and emotional wellness for migrants and refugees, we talk about the concept of wellness a lot. And this is not the absence of pathology. That is to say, if somebody isn't sick, we don't necessarily assume that they are well. These are some things just to consider, right? Some manifestations of trauma. If a person has experienced any of the three of the legs of the triple trauma paradigm, it is possible that upon entering their new community, they will experience physical ailments, such as unknown etiology pain. Oftentimes, people who are going to the hospital, maybe for the first time since arriving to the US, will begin to complain about things like back pain or shoulder pain or pain in their legs, only to find out that the doctor isn't really able to identify the source of their pain. So they often feel like the doctor is not listening or that the translation services are inadequate. Regardless of what it is, they just sort of start feeling desperate because nobody seems to be able to take them, quote, seriously, in order to be able to be competent enough to identify what's wrong with them. And in reality, these are just sort of manifestations of anxiety and a person's trauma. It's not to say they're not in physical pain, but getting somebody to understand that is really quite difficult. So again, it's a very common thing to experience, to have clients who are experiencing physical pain that that the medical community is not really able to assist them with, right? There's of course manifestations in terms of their emotional wellness and health and mental health, lack of sleep, nightmares, depression, anxiety are all things that you are likely to see in this population. I think it's important to talk about spirituality. Oftentimes people who have resettled are in such despair that they feel that their deities and their gods may have abandoned them, or they start having a great deal of doubt. They just kind of lose the concept that they can rely on a higher power, so as to begin to believe that things will eventually be okay. In a more practical way, oftentimes people just don't know where to turn to identify and find the communities that they like to worship with, or the places of worship that they need in order to continue their practices. recently arrived migrants and refugees also experience a great deal of isolation. And if any of the previous bullet points are true for them, then one can expect them to be even more isolated, right? And isolation can compound issues of trauma, and certainly compound and make it provide a more complex diagnostic picture when somebody is experiencing anxiety and depression and things of the sort. In general, their functioning can be very much compromised. In regards to mental health and emotional wellness, several counties throughout the U.S. have begun to screen refugees as they arrive. It's now part of their resettlement process. One of the screening tools is the RHS-15, and the data that you see here relates to that particular screening tool. There is a cutoff or a threshold. If somebody scores above the threshold, their position is that that person has a 95% probability that they meet criteria for an anxiety or a mood disorder. So what we know now is that 30% of the resettled refugees are actually meeting that threshold. And so the numbers break down like this. About 10% of the resettled population will experience symptoms related to PTSD. About 5% of the population will experience depression, and a little under 5% will experience anxiety-like disorders. How can we best respond to these needs? So from a trauma-informed perspective, it's important that we consider the whole person and their environment. So as an example, it's possible that you're helping somebody fill out a form or an application for disability services or something like that. But what you don't realize is that this person survived 25 years in a refugee camp. Or it's possible that you are driving somebody to a medical appointment, but you don't realize that this person just arrived to the United States after an arduous journey as a minor, because they look maybe like they're an adult, and experience some sort of harassment and or experience some sort of assault or experience some sort of being trafficked, victimization of some sort. We try to avoid re-traumatizing people whenever possible. Clearly, asking people to retell their stories over and over can be very triggering. One of the best ways that we can avoid this actually is to ensure that your documentation is adequate and complete and useful and communicates clearly what the events that took place that the client has just shared with you is, such that the next person who reads your notes has a complete picture and is able to put together information to best help and assist a particular client. Step up your cultural responsiveness. You know, this is not a process by which one eventually feels as if they have completed the necessary steps to be fully culturally responsive. What we know about this work is that it's constantly changing. And so you can't possibly know the things that you don't know. But there are a lot of resources, and to be able to understand who folks are, where are they coming from, what languages do they speak, what religions do they practice, why have they left their countries of origin, is incredibly important, and it will be incredibly useful and helpful to your clients. Recognize, please, when clients choose not to share information with you. They are clearly sometimes protecting themselves. They may not want to tell you if somebody in their household is working. They may not want to tell you who lives in their household. So folks have a lot of good reason to withhold information. And sometimes we feel like we can sort of build that relationship with them rather soon. And sometimes it happens maybe on our timeline versus their timeline, right? Working on creating a safe space so that people can share their individual stories. The story of a migrant and the story of a refugee is a very healing, it can be a very healing process. And so we need to uphold that, and we need to create a safe space where that can happen. And if we can't create that, then we need to be able to develop and or find a place for them. And then again, focus on building resilience and promoting protective factors. We're all resilient by nature. Trauma is rather a response to events in our life. And so being able to build on that resilience and those protective factors will be invaluable to your clients. Thank you for your attention. If you need any more information, feel free to contact us at our website. Also, be really great if you could follow us on our social media. Any of the topics that have been addressed here in this module can be expanded on, and Rain would be happy to continue the conversation with you, your particular agency. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.